Good morning, everybody, or afternoon, depending on where you are. I'm on the Pacific Coast, so it's still morning for us. I'm here with my good friend Lauren, and we are going to talk about peptides because I've had a lot of questions about it. And before we begin, I just want Lauren to introduce herself and her background so you're all aware, of her expertise.
Yeah, thanks everyone for joining, and thank you so much, Jen, for having me. We did a live together. I think it was almost a year ago on Instagram.
Yeah.
Um, I have a PhD in integrative physiology, so I've studied muscle physiology and the intersection between how the muscle responds to exercise and different hormone profiles. And before I was a scientist, I worked in fitness, so I kind of have the practical trainer, health practitioner, researcher, kind of blend that into the way that I communicate science. And these days, I do a lot of just addressing kind of popular claims that I see online, especially ones that are directed towards women, so we can kind of cut through the noise and make evidence-based decisions.
Well, I no better person to have a little conversation about peptides. And my idea to have this came about because I got first of all, I'm sure like everybody else, you've seen all the marketing and all the push but I got a direct message from somebody a little while ago and it really made me sad that, and I'm just paraphrasing it, but, I think I was ranting on Instagram about, unregulated things and how, it is buyer beware and you need to be careful. And, she said, like, what am I supposed to do? I see all my friends going to these clinics and getting peptides and they're losing weight and they look amazing. And here you're telling me that I shouldn't, partake in that. And obviously I'm not telling anybody to do anything, but I really think that people have no idea what we're talking about when we're talking about peptides. And I think that if people actually understood, there'd be a little bit more like, "Whoa." And I would position that marketing peptides to women in the way that it's done is inherently misogynistic because there's no science. Everybody talks about how, women have been underserved in research. Women, deserve to be in more clinical trials. And here we're talking about products that are literally going from animal studies to using in humans. And that is the exact opposite of what we've been advocating for. So let's start with Lauren. Why don't you explain to us what peptides are?
Yeah, we make peptides endogenously or in the body, and they're shorter chains of amino acids. So you might know proteins as longer chains of amino acids. And in the body, peptides act like chemical messengers. So you might send a peptide from one organ to another organ with a message. So let's say from the pancreas to the liver, we need to increase blood sugar. Or let's say we have a wound that needs healing. So cells around that area might release a signal to say, hey, we need repair molecules to kind of go towards this area so we can help repair the wound. Um, Basically, they act really quickly, and there are many, many of them, but they tend to act quickly, and then they're just broken down by enzymes. So although we make these peptides, the way that peptide drugs work is quite dissimilar and by design.
Yeah. And so some example like insulin's a peptide. So we've all heard about that. Oxytocin's a peptide, but we're not all showing up in clinics getting these administered. So talking about them in a broad sense, you say, well, if you're going to get a drug, like what does that specific drug do? And I think we're all familiar with, because the GLP-1s are also peptides, right? So this is where it gets confusing because there are some peptides that have been made into pharmaceutical products that are very valuable. So in obstetrics, for example, oxytocin is a peptide. And we use that in labor and delivery units, right? So, but it's been formulated in a way that it can be used in the body. It's also been tested. And the same with GLP-1s. Now, tell us about this like wild world of sort of biohacking peptides because there's so many claims, right? Oh, it could increase growth hormone or it can increase blood vessels. And so tell us a little bit about some of these products.
Yeah, so the purpose of a peptide drug is to either extend that signal that I described earlier. And so you either make that signal last longer, or you inject the drug that's going to signal to a natural process, like, instead of injecting growth hormone, you're saying, okay, I'm going to inject a peptide that will tell the body, hey, release more growth hormone. And so GLP-1s, for example, we have natural GLP-1. And so you'll see a lot of really nonsense marketing about, that some food you should eat or some supplement you should take that is going to increase your natural GLP-1. The problem with natural GLP-1 is it lasts for about 2 minutes and then it goes away. So the drug, the semaglutide, has been genetically modified, chemically synthesized to last for several days, which is why people can get these weekly injections. So the all of this, the synthesis of these drugs is incredibly complicated because you're trying to start with something that acts in the body in a natural way that may involve many, many different tissues and organs, and typically is short acting. And then you're saying, well, what if we kind of turn this on and keep it on, or turn this off and keep it off? And so there's a lot of what ifs in that game, if you will. And not that it's not valuable. I think that there are approved peptide drugs that are excellent, and we know that they work, and know that they're safe because they've been studied in animals and then in phase 1, 2, and 3 clinical trials. So meaning by the end of those trials, you have a sense of the efficacy, the safety, the interaction with other drugs, the different populations, the dosing. Whereas if you only have those rodent trials, then we don't know so many of those important pieces that I just described. So these wellness peptides are drugs that have been around in the kind of biohacking space for a while. And so CJC 1295 is one that's common. BPC 157 is another one that's common. And the claims around these stem from, fat loss, muscle growth, skin, dramatic healing from surgery or injury. Uh, and the problem, really, when you look at this data, which I was compelled to do because I kind of saw this trend to these peptide drugs leaving the biohacking world and entering mainstream wellness. And I'm sure we'll talk about it, but given the recent changes in the regulations, I think that will be even more explosive than I anticipated.
Yeah, no, I think that I actually think, and this is, a discussion we're gonna have at the end, but I actually think that we could be seeing the beginning of the end of good pharma. Just like we may not be getting more vaccines. I mean, I think that this is really creating some terrible, we're at these branch points where something could go really, really terribly, with the, why bother studying something? You can just give it to people and then see what happens, which is the exact opposite of science. So one thing I wanted to talk about is I think a lot of people don't know that in the United States, you can't market a drug for human use if it hasn't been, studied and approved. And you can't tell people that supplements do something unless they've been studied. And a lot of the ways the marketing gets around this is the vials of these products literally say like not for human use or for research use, right? And that fine print may not get translated to you. And of course, looking at who's running Health and Human Services and the FDA, the chance that there's going to be crackdowns on that are probably, you know, low.
Unlikely.
Yeah, but I think that's first of all important for you to realize that if you're getting a peptide from a wellness clinic and it's not like a brand name GLP-1, right? So if you're
Yeah.
getting Govi, that's different. But if you're getting you're getting a peptide that's sold for wellness, this is not, it will have on the vial somewhere, they're just not telling you this is for research purposes only or not for human use. So one question a lot of people have, well, where do these come from? Well, anybody can start a lab and make stuff is very Walter White. I think that if you've watched Breaking Bad, and so you don't know, is the person making your peptide a genius chemist like Walter White, or is the person making your peptide literally somebody who their kid, if you walked in and you saw them baking in their kitchen, they've gone to the bathroom and they haven't washed their hands, and that kind of thing, right? And things that are made in that way, often are contaminated. And there was a study by one of the companies that actually tests these drugs, and they found that 8% of this one kind of peptide were contaminated with endotoxins. So no so somebody's asking about the hers semiglutide is basically meth in a kitchen. It's from a compounding pharmacy, and those are, that's we're not talking about those per se, but because when there's no generic drug, when there's no FDA approved generic, you can't say that what you're getting is equivalent with a compounded GLP-1 and something that is from the company. So I just think that's an important thing for people to understand. Once there's a generic available, meaning people have applied to the FDA, they've shown their product is the same, that's completely different. So with your compounded GLP-1s, we don't have that process. But so just getting back to from these wellness semiglutides, that there have been cases of people ending up in the ICU from getting injections.
Yeah, well, if you think about people even getting those vitamin injections at med spas, there are reports about people getting really terrible bacterial infections from those too. So I think there's always going to be an inherent risk with any sort of injectable, and I think that the popularity and the efficacy of the GLP-1s have kind of normalized injectables, which is adding to the reason that this is becoming kind of more mainstream. But we need to remember that even if these go from being manufactured literally wherever, because until yesterday, they weren't even allowed to be made in compounding pharmacies in the US, meaning they're literally coming from who knows. And so that means you don't know if it's properly dosed, even though we don't really know how to dose them because we don't have enough human trials to really establish that. But you don't know if the dose is what it's supposed to be, or if there is any kind of contaminant in that vial. And that's a real concern. um, so I think there's sort of a two-part conversation of, let's actually look at these drugs and make sure they are going to work, and will have result we're after. And then there's also, okay, if yes, then we need to procure it from a safe, clean, pure source. And if neither of those are happening, then we can see a lot of problematic outcomes. And maybe there won't be problematic outcomes. The point is we just don't know. And the way these are marketed in the wellness space, it's often a few of these peptides that have, just letters and numbers. And then they're saying, this is the glow blend, and it's some combination of three of these. So there's a whole other level of, you really don't know what you're getting. And I think there's a lot of people who don't really understand how little we know about these compounds. And they deserve that information before they make a decision to use them or not.
Yeah, and I would say it's even worse than being just experimented on, because you're being experimented on for profit. Also, in a real experiment, data is actually tracked and there's outcomes. So it's the idea, like these wellness blend. So yeah, the blends, we don't even know how could they interact. We just don't have the data, and literally, I think that for example, if you talk about something that improves wound healing and it's supposed to improve blood vessel growth. Well, what if you have we all have small potential cancers that develop at any time in our bodies, and our body has systems for attacking them and killing them and taking it out. We have all these surveillance systems. What if you're now giving those cells a boost of blood vessels? Now your system might not be able to catch up and get rid of these little, mutations that now could become something, whereas before they never would, because we've messed with the whole system.
Yeah.
And those are the things that get really concerning, because we might not know for 5 or 10 years what the complications are. We don't know. This whole idea that, like, angiogenesis, increasing blood vessel growth, is beneficial. It's like, sometimes yes, sometimes no. And I think that it's just really important. The same with growth hormone. What's that going to do? What could be the impact on the pituitary? Could we be impacting people's pituitary glands? So down the road, they're going to now actually need to be on other hormonal support. Like, we don't know. And I think the problem is that because these drugs are claiming to do some very powerful things, the not knowing becomes even like more concerning.
Yeah, because it's also possible that they're okay for very short-term use, right? Because there are approved drugs that fall into that category, right? You can use them, but you don't want to be on them for too long for a variety of reasons. But when we think about a drug that is going to send a message and have all these downstream effects, if that message is fairly general, like make new blood vessels, as you said, or grow, then we can say, oh, grow, that means muscle growth. But it also means growth in many unwanted areas potentially. And so we just don't know. And I fear that without that without that knowledge, we're going to have some, maybe we won't know short term, maybe it'll take a while, but whether it's people having issues due to the contaminants or people having issues due to the drugs themselves or the interaction between all of these, it's going to be very difficult to know because really all we have, I'll use, the BPC 157, for example, is this magic recovery drug that people are saying, it heals muscles, tendons, nerves, bone. And there are impressive data in genetically modified rodents, meaning you delete a gene and breed a special line of mice or rats. And then you say, in the absence of this gene, if I inject this drug, does it start to do the things it would if the gene were active, and then some? So this is a interesting, like, mechanistic animal model that is extremely dissimilar to human physiology. And that's why time and time again we see exciting potential mechanisms in rodents that just do not translate to humans.
Yeah, I think I looked it up, and I might be misquoting, but I'm only off probably by a percentage. I think the number of the percentage, like when something is shown to be beneficial in rodents, that it actually ends up translating into, this is a drug we're going to prescribe and it's got benefit, something like 8%. So it's very low. And, these are great animal models, and the ability to, breed mice that are missing certain genes. So you can be sure, okay, we know it's working this way because we're replacing the thing that's lost, right? Versus giving it to the animals that aren't missing the gene. So these are incredibly powerful, powerful ways to study things. But people need to know that these wellness peptides are literally going from that to going into your blood. So we don't even know how it works in a phase 1 trial. We don't know how humans respond to it. We don't know if it does what it does. There's no post-marketing surveillance, so we don't know the complications. And because these are very clandestine, so as opposed to sort of compounded GLP-1s, which I still have issues with, but because that's mainstream, this is much less of a clandestine sort of operation, right? These people are literally making up chemicals in their lab.
And probably what you're buying from one source or another isn't even exactly the same drug. I mean, almost certainly that's the case because there isn't, as I mentioned earlier, it's not just about, isolating the peptide from the body or from the animal. It's all of these modifications that you're making in the lab after the fact that are incredibly complex. And so there's a lot of trial and error for how you are kind of tweaking things in order to ensure you're getting the response that you desire, that it's lasting for the amount of time you desire, and you're not getting an unwanted immune response, which is one of the biggest problems with the formulation of these peptide drugs.
Can you explain that a little bit more for people? So unwanted immune response, what that might mean?
Yeah, so the purpose of the drug is so it's not acting like exactly as you would if you injected the peptide we make. Because if it's too similar, it's just going to break down like our natural peptides do. So they're processed, they're broken down by enzymes. So with these drugs, you want them to act and act for long enough so that they're not immediately broken down by enzymes. And so that's all of that tweaking that I was describing. Now, the danger is the body recognizes this as a foreign substance. And when that happens, then can release all of these antibodies and say, okay, we need to attack. And you can have a range of immune responses, including something really serious like anaphylaxis. But that's part of why these clinical trials are so important because it's not just about, oh, what are these minor side effects? It's, okay, is this actually doing what we want it to from a purely, mechanistic pharmacological stage to over the long term, are we getting the desired outcome without any serious or less serious side effects? And then you move forward into more and more trials in more and more people.
And it and so now there's this claim that we heard from RFK Jr. that they're going to allow a bunch of these peptides to be made by compounding pharmacies. And I think that this adds just another layer. And I think, unfortunately, it makes it seem to the general public like that it might be safe. But when a drug is completely unstudied, we actually don't know how to mix it for human delivery, right? So we don't know, like, do you put it in an acid base? Do you put it in like what do you mix it with? What are the actual ingredients that should go along with it? And could these things work in ways that are then now harmful where it's not? And also, there's very, very little regulation for compounding pharmacies. And I would recommend anybody who is using a compounded drug to read the book Kill Shot. I think the author's name is Brian Dearborn. I could have his last name wrong, but if you Google Kill Shot book, compounding pharmacies, you know, there was a terrible outbreak of people who got serious complications from compounded steroids made at compounding pharmacies, and they're for spinal injections, and some people died from abscesses, and other people had terrible complications. And if you think that they're regulated in the same way that that a medication being made by big pharma is, it's not. And so I just think that there's so much money to be made in compounding and very little regulation. And then now there's going to be Jason Deeren. Thank you. That's the author. Thank you for saying that. Yeah. It's the book Kill Shot. Honestly, if you were using a compounded medication, I would say it behooves you to read that book. So you understand, everything about it. But yeah, so we're going to see a lot of heavy marketing, and I would imagine my guess is that we're going to see a lot of telemedicine companies that kind of move in.
Yeah,
So,
I think that's highly likely because well, it's interesting. When they come off that list, they were on the list because of potential serious safety concerns. And I think they went on that list in 2024. It could be end of 2023. And then if they're coming off, then one would imagine there was something between then and now that would uh, give us a sufficient level of confidence that there aren't sufficient safety concerns. And that data doesn't exist. So, we're talking about some of these peptides have been around for a couple of decades and have been studied in humans. Have been studied in rodents. And then, in the case of BPC 157, there was a trial in Croatia with ulcerative colitis patients, and that data was just never reported. The clinical trial was registered and then it disappeared. A couple years later, there was a trial in Mexico, and it was just looking at the kind of pharmacology. Can we do some blood markers? Can we see if it's actually increasing some of those markers that we would intend? They registered, they reported that they had completed data collection, they had a submission date for their findings, and they canceled the submission of their findings. And it's since then, the only human data that we have in BPC 157 is one trial, if you can call it that, of two patients where they gave them an acute infusion and then assessed some cardiac biomarkers and said nothing terrible happened in two people. And the other is a retrospective analysis where they found people who had been using BPC 157 injections for knee pain. They called them. There were 12 people that they were able to get in touch with. And they said, a year ago, you were using these for injections. Did it help? And 7 of the 12 said yes. That's it.
And I think it's really important for people to understand too, you don't actually know what those people took. So
Right.
in a pharmaceutical trial, like if I gave whatever 25 people oral estrace and then I called them up, because first of all, that's a terrible study design. But at least I know that they would have got the dose of estrogen that was prescribed. So when you're talking about these medications, because there was no purity testing beforehand, so you don't know what they actually got.
Right. And of course, what we would really want is an initial trial where you have a control group, because a lot of these outcomes, like pain and recovery, are really quite subjective, and they are incredibly susceptible to placebo. If you look at these sham surgery studies, for example, where half of the patients need an MCL repair, or all of them need an MCL. I think it's MCL. It could be ACL. I think MCL. Anyway, half of the people actually get the repair, and the other half of the people just get an incision, and then we say, we gave you the surgery, but they didn't give them the surgery. And then everyone goes through the same physical therapy post-op, and the results are the same in terms of their recovery and subjective pain. So that is an incredibly powerful example of, yeah, just because you use an intervention doesn't necessarily mean that your positive response was attributable to that intervention.
And then we have to talk about, so now you're going to a wellness clinic to get your peptide infusion and they're treating you very nicely. And you're probably in a lovely spa-like setting getting this infusion. And they're chatting with you and maybe they're also talking about diet and other things. I don't know. I don't know how it works out. But so you're the more you pay for something, the greater the placebo response. Now that's been shown in quite a lot of studies. And there's actually a fascinating study with I believe it was Parkinson's patients where they were told they were given either a generic drug, they were given a placebo that they were told was generic, and a placebo that they were told was a fancy new pharmaceutical. Now, the people who got the real drug obviously did the best, but the people who got the expensive placebo over the generic placebo did better.
Yeah.
So I just think it's really important for people to understand that when you're going to a clinic like this, you have built in a placebo response because there's all this kind of smoke and mirrors. And also, we don't like to believe we were misled, right?
Yeah.
That's very human nature. So, I think that once you go to that clinic, you are sort of inclined to say that you got a beneficial effect. It's all human nature, and I don't mean for anyone to think that that I'm thinking poorly. I'm not. It's just people are being victimized. I think that's really, and there've been a few questions that have come up about what's the legality of this? Well, so I mean, it's been operating in a gray area for a long time, which shouldn't have been operating, right? But the because there's these patchwork regulations, I mean, somebody has to report them, the FDA has to decide they wanna take action, and part of the problem is the FDA is really pretty toothless when it's not a pharmaceutical. So, they can send, like, we've had this discussion, or I've written this about supplement companies before. When they make claims, so you can basically sell whatever you want as long as you don't make like an actual like drug claim, basically. Like, oh, I'm making this turmeric and it's to support your immune function. Well, that's not an actual claim. It's just garbage. So you can do that. And so all they can do are send like anemic warning letters. That's really all that they can do. So, and if you look at, I know I've been speaking about compounding pharmacies. If you look up some of the compounders online, you'll see if you go to the FDA, and I don't even know if they're doing any, because again, a lot of this is state level, but if you go, you can actually look up the reports of, what happened when they went out and had an investigation about cleanliness or other types of things. So, but these people are understaffed and they really don't have there's no tooth. So the only thing I would think that's gonna happen, and which is what we've seen with supplements, is if somebody dies and a district attorney gets involved, then it becomes a criminal case. I think that would be the only situation. And somebody said you can find some reports for pharmaceutical companies as well. I have no doubt. Factories get closed down, but the difference is regulation and not regulation. And I think that when things are not regulated, you know, I hypercapitalism doesn't seem to be very good for the consumer.
Yeah, someone said in the chat, well, how can they prescribe them if they're not regulated? Well, I mean, we were saying this earlier, but they're being sold right now from a lot of them are coming from China, and they say for research purposes only, or not for human use, or for in vitro use only. And so right now, a lot of the wellness clinics and influencers that are promoting them, that's really the source that they're getting from. But some of these companies are buying them in very large quantities and then reselling them or using them in wellness clinics, so the end user doesn't actually see that label that it's not for use in humans.
Yeah. I mean, I think that you should just assume if you're going to get you should assume if you're going to get an IV peptide, and we're not talking about GLP-1s here. So if you're getting anything else that's marketed as a peptide, it hasn't been studied in humans. And there's been some comments about, well, there's nurse practitioners doing it and chiropractors doing it. Everybody's doing it. It's not, this isn't like this is you don't need a medical license to give you don't need to be able to prescribe or it like.
No, we can work at a spa and just order it and give it to people. So, I think that's what people really need to understand, that it's not that, I think the way it's being marketed right now is so disingenuous, because you would think that, "Oh, this is just an add-on to my facial or my massage at the wellness spa," but really it's far more nefarious than that, and the people who are promoting these have such an incentive financially. I get emails fairly regularly to promote supplements. I obviously don't. But I've recently been getting emails from these peptide companies saying, "Join us. Our creators are making upwards of $20,000 a month." So, as you see, and mark my words, you'll see it, more and more influencers with some link in their bio showing how the peptides changed their body or miraculously healed them post surgery. They have a major financial incentive to spread that message.
Yeah. Are the other people saying they got those emails? Yeah, I mean, there's some questions about, is this regulated differently in Canada? I actually don't know. Do you have any insight there?
I know there are clinics where you can get those same injections. There's nothing unique about the BPC 157 you would get at a clinic in Toronto versus a clinic in Tampa. I imagine they're sourcing it similarly, but I don't. Other than the fact that it is accessible in that same way, I think it's less easy for you personally to order them online if you're in Canada, but that's sort of the extent of my knowledge.
Yeah, I mean, the problem is when people are, when there's a gray area, there's a gray area. And I think the problem is the way wellness comes up with ways to capitalize on gray areas faster than governments can move to regulate them. And I think that there is an inordinate amount of lobbying. I know a little bit about the Canadian experience. They've been moving to have more and more, regulation of supplements. And I wrote about the report in Canada. I actually did. If you go back, I did one of my PowerPoint presentations on my Substack, where I talked about, they had a big report in Canada. I think it was in 2021, where they, and it might be 2020, I can't remember, where they looked at, like the cleanliness and the all the issues related to how supplements were being made in Canada. And a significant number of places failed. So they said we have to have more regulation here. And I know that the Trudeau government was planning on trying to move the regulation up faster, and the massive pushback was really challenging. In fact, they said they'd had more pushback on that than on many other things. So I just think that it's really important for people to understand that when you have these areas, they're so easy to exploit. I mean, in Canada, you can get a homeopathic medication that's got the whatever the Health Canada stamp, because you just have to fill regulatory paperwork. So um, governments aren't looking out for you as well as they could. And again, part of it is because all of this moves so quickly.
Well, and clinical trials move very slowly. So
Yeah.
if we actually wanted to have sufficient data on these compounds, then it would take a while. But I must say that it's a bit telling that um, with all the rodent data in some of these, that we haven't seen someone come to the table and get excited about the potential efficacy and I mean, and money making opportunity with any of these. And people will say, "Oh, well, like there's too much red tape, and there's no incentive for a pharmaceutical company to take on one of these drugs." But I I would say that's not the case. It's really, well, at this point, it's kind of the opposite, that now that it's kind of a free for all and everyone can make money on these, then there will be less of an incentive to do high quality research. That said, I think if in these early stages, a drug company was able to identify one of these as a potential moneymaker, then they would have pushed forward with more human trials.
Yeah, it's really funny. A lot of this stuff, not funny, it's sad. But a lot of the things that end up making their way into wellness space were things that, the chemists and the pharmaceutical companies were like, yeah, we dicked around with that in the lab for like 3 years, and it was clearly like not going to work. There have been a couple of comments about compounded GLP-1s. And I just think it's really important. I'm going to read you this from the FDA. I have it up on my site. So the FDA is taking steps to combat misleading direct-to-consumer advertising and marketing following warning letters that were sent in the fall of 2025. This is about compounded GLP-1s. In promotional materials, companies cannot claim that non-FDA approved compounded products are generic versions or the same as drugs approved by the FDA. They also cannot state compounded drugs use the same active ingredient as the FDA approved drug, or that the compounded drugs are clinically proven to produce the results for the patients. So it's certainly your choice to use a compounded GLP-1. It's absolutely your choice to do that. But if the company is telling you that it is the same active ingredient, they legally can't say that. So that's what we're saying here is that, and that's a separate conversation. This whole peptide conversation, we're not really talking about that. But I just think that it's that generics get approved in a way to prove to the FDA that the drug is the same within a very small margin of error. And when you don't have that happening, you don't have that proof. And I think that's what that is. So, but again, this is why did they allow it during the shortages? Because there were shortages, and sometimes rules have to be bent. So, but anyway, let's get back to
Yeah, and I mean, I think that we see kind of tangentially the marketing of the microdosing GLP-1, which has never been studied, and the oral drops, which are probably just a huge waste of money. But people will take something that is effective and then try to twist it around in ways that may or may not be more identifiable than others. So you'll see, people will say this eating this one food is just like being on a GLP-1, and it's like anything you can do to attach yourself, then you will, because you're taking something that actually works and then trying to kind of capitalize on that.
yeah. And so I just think it's, as we see, I do find it's really fascinating that on one hand, Marty McCary's talking about the FDA taking action against, the people selling compounded GLP-1s and saying that they're the same. And yet we have RFK Jr. saying, we're going to let the compounding pharmacies go wild with peptides. Whether that actually happens, I don't know. But because the statements are completely opposite of each other. So it's a real fascinating, it's just fascinating. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, I think that the peptides are worse than what
Oh
was
yeah, no,
happening with the
absolutely.
GLP-1.
No,
Because
but I
at
guess
least
my point is that we have it's like like the the legislation's opposite of each other or
yes.
lack of legislation. I mean, so it's like on one hand, we're like, we're going to crack down here because people shouldn't be misled about whether the drugs are exactly the same or not. But on the other hand, we're going to let you make whatever you want. And so it's the policies are completely opposed to each other. So I find that, and I think it's just probably reflective of the chaos of the administration.
Yeah, I mean, and just the tendency to be so, I don't even know what the right word is. I think a little bit thoughtless, and really jumping the gun on something that uh, maybe it'll all be fine. But I think there's a good enough chance that it won't, that I'm really concerned for people. And I remember as a teenager or when I was in college, being pitched like the new cleanse and the new diet that didn't work, the new supplement that didn't work. And I totally fell for all of that stuff. I did a lot of, you know, just it was either a waste of money, maybe it wasn't that harmful, but it certainly wasn't helpful, and it didn't kind of it helped me establish a good way of exercising and dieting. But if it if that were me today and I was seeing all of this, I would be such a target for this stuff. And so I just think there are going to be so many girls and women who are desperately seeking that thing. And then these companies are just going to swoop in and take advantage. And that is just really heartbreaking.
Yeah, and I mean, if you think about it younger and younger, we don't know the impact. Like all of these things, we also don't know the impact. But, if you think about, well, what's the difference between getting one of these peptides that promotes growth hormone while you're still actively building bone versus when you're not, right? Like, or what? what's the impact on a growing body versus a body that's not. And I want to just get back again to regulation. And I always hate that it sounds like I'm supporting big pharma, and really, because I think the prices are egregious. What I am supporting are regulations, because regulations are what protect people. You know, whether you look at, airplanes, drugs, cars. If we don't have regulations, it's very easy for things that become very dangerous for consumers, or potentially dangerous. And I want to just, like, I've written about this study before, but there's a drug called galantamine, which is used apparently in neurology. It's also available as a supplement. So you can buy it as a prescription and you can buy it as a supplement. So this is an ideal way to study the impact of regulations on making products for human consumption. And they looked at 10 generic manufacturers and 10, supplements. And what they found was, with the generics, the pills all contained, between 97 and 104% of the galantamine, and there was no bacterial contamination. So you got what you were expecting to get. With the supplements, the amount of galantamine in the product ranged from 2% to 110%. And that's a really common thing with a lot of these supplements, is that it's rare that they have too much. It's often that they barely have the substance, they don't have it at all. But 30% of the supplements were contaminated for enterotoxin genes, for
Mm.
Bacillus cereus, which is a cause of food poisoning. 30% were contaminated. Now, it's a small sample size, it's 10, but it really just showed, that one study to me illustrates why regulations are needed, why we have to have factories inspected, why all these things matter.
Yeah, and I think most importantly that people are aware of what the risks that are associated with deciding to use some of these. Because I think when you take a supplement that could be underdosed, for the most part, you're just wasting your money. Like,
Yeah,
there can be harmful side effects, but generally speaking, it's usually that you're wasting your money and you're potentially getting something like I think I posted a while ago about these creatine gummies that were all these brands of creatine gummies, and someone did an independent analysis and they had basically no creatine. So that happens all the time in the supplement world. But we can people will say to me all the time, "Well, I know the data on collagen is kind of weak, but why not just take it just in case?" Or, "I know you say that the data on creatine for cognitive function is really, really preliminary, but why not just take it just in case?" And I say, "Well, in isolation, you can make that choice, but if you start making that choice over and over and over again, then you have to start thinking about not only the financial implications, but also the interactions, and potential duplicative nature of all these things that you start taking. Now, if we start the same approach with some of these injectable peptides, then we're on a really slippery slope here because we're already kind of taking all of these supplements just in case they might help. And then we start stacking all of these peptides just in case they might work. And now not only are we out a lot of money, we've opened ourselves up to substantial risk that started compounding, no pun intended, just from the original example of, oh, I just started taking collagen just in case.
right. Yeah, I think that, and then of course there's a lot of exposure to conspiracy theories and other things that can come along the way. There's sort of this other sort of harm. And so, I think, I think people just, the take home message that I like people to know is, these peptides that are sold for wellness. We're not talking about GLP-1s here. These peptides that are sold for wellness. They are unstudied. So there are many, many layers of concerns. We don't know what they do in humans. Because they're coming from labs that are making things that are unstudied for humans. I don't want something that I'm putting in my body to come from a lab like that. Like I want all the regulations. I want the people coming. So you have all these layers of concerns. And if now they're going to be mass marketed, basically, if they're allowed to be compounded, you're going to get all kinds of advertising about them. And you just need to know there's no data.
Yeah, there's a one of the other kind of popular ones that's out there, ipamorelin, that's often stacked with CJC 1295, and the only human data, and it's marketed for fat loss or kind of body recomposition. So we're going to take CJC 1295 and increase muscle mass. We're going to take um, ipamorelin to decrease body fat, and they're going to kind of work together by targeting the growth hormone receptors in different ways. Now, there's studies that show it actually increases growth hormone in the blood, increases IGF-1 in the blood after you inject it, and that's it. So that tells us exactly nothing about muscle growth and fat loss. And in fact, when you look at the rodent data, the rodents actually gained weight on with ipamorelin injections. So, we're talking about these potential mechanisms by which, okay, if you're increasing growth hormone, then theoretically you might increase muscle mass, and theoretically you might decrease body fat. But we can't say that this is actually going to affect our outcome of interest when we're not even close to studying it for that purpose. And many of these drugs, it might be that it was originally going to be studied in a clinical population for another purpose, and then there was kind of an offshoot because they realized as they were studying it, oh, maybe we could use it for this other purpose. Um, but in this case, I mean, it doesn't even come close. So you're just taking a theoretical rationale about the way these compounds could interact in the body, and then making really, really bold claims.
Yeah. I think I'd like to end on, knowing that we just don't have the data. This is so much buyer beware. And I think that I would be very wary about um, places that offer this, that push it, that are profiting from it, because they're literally profiting from, you know, a
Our
complete,
ignorance.
yeah, they're literally, and so what does that say about them? What does that say about somebody? So it either says that they haven't, there's two possibilities, and neither of them are good. One is that they know there's no data and they don't care. The other is they're unaware and they haven't looked into it, or they believe that rat studies should be translated to human use. So neither are a good look. They're both very bad. And then you think, okay, this is just a way to extract money from people. That's really what it is.
Yeah, I think we need to understand, what would you expect from your healthcare professional if you were going to take a medication or if you were going into a surgery? Wouldn't you want to know all of the potential side effects and the risks, and all of that would be explained to you so that you could make an informed decision? And if your doctor was kind of pulling the wool over your eyes and pretending there weren't the possibilities of these, risks or side effects or downsides, then that would be malpractice. You'd be really pissed. So we should think about these the same way.
Right. I just so that's what we know about peptides. It's just very little. I think I saw somebody. I think I saw someone post a meme about here are all the human clinical trials on peptides, and it was just a blank page. And yeah, I mean, people have said, well, what about regulations? Yeah, absolutely. I am huge pro regulation, but there are, because of the way that supplements we're allowed to sort of have this carve out in the United States, that has really led to all of this. And there's sort of regulations for stricter regulations for some, and then the lack of regulation depending how things kind of uh, get further and further away from a prescription drug. And I just think it's important for people to know. Um, and so yeah, so peptides are unstudied. Again, we're not talking about GLP-1s. There's a lot of data about that, but we did have some discussion about you know, potential differences with compounded versus not, versus brand name. And so I'll give you the final word, Lauren. Do you have anything else you want to add?
No, thank you so much for having me. And I hope that what people take away from this is just that we want to increase awareness so that people can make an informed decision. And as we see more and more people start promoting this stuff mainstream, we just want people to understand that the benefits are unclear and the safety profile also unclear.
Yeah. And I'll just add one final thing. There have been a couple of questions about different supplements. Um, if supplements were proven to do different things, they would be in the guidelines from different medical professional organizations. So, for example, there's guidelines about the amount of calcium that you should take. So I would look that up. And if you are someone who wants to take a supplement, you should be making sure that what you're taking is at least third party tested. So it contains what it claims. And so those would be labels like USP. And it should be prominently displayed that it should be labeled on the supplement. It shouldn't just be on the website that it's third party tested. They should tell you specifically who has done the third party testing, so you can be aware. Because otherwise, you just don't know. So thank you everybody for joining. Thank you, Lauren, for taking time out of your day. And I hope that you don't have too much snow cleanup to do later.
Thank you for having me. Thanks,
Bye bye.
everyone.
Thanks everybody for joining.